"You're not supposed to be here," she said quietly, and for a split second, even the flashing red and blue lights seemed to hesitate against the walls. The pounding on the door had started less than 10 seconds earlier, sharp and mechanical, like something practiced, not urgent, and now the entire street was washed in color, sirens muted but present, a low electric hum pressing against the night air. Naomi Carter stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, the other still holding a dish towel lamp with soap and warm water, the scent of lemon cleaner lingering faintly in the hallway behind her. Through the frosted glass panel, she could see silhouettes, too many of them, broad shoulders, rigid stances, radios clipped high on their chests, and the unmistakable outline of authority that didn't ask permission. "Ma'am, open the door now." A voice called out, amplified but controlled, the kind of voice trained to command without raising volume. Naomi didn't move right away. Her eyes flicked once toward the living room, where a small lamp cast a soft amber glow over a couch with a neatly folded blanket, a pair of children's sneakers tucked beside it, laces undone like they'd been kicked off in a hurry. The clock on the wall read 9:17 p.m. Too early for chaos. Too late for mistakes. The knock came again, harder this time, not violent, but deliberate, like a countdown had already begun somewhere she couldn't see. Naomi exhaled slowly, her breath steady, measured, the kind of breath that didn't belong to someone surprised. When she finally turned the knob, the door opened only halfway before a hand on the other side pushed it wider, controlled but firm, and the night spilled in with it. Cool air, the faint scent of asphalt, and the synchronized movement of bodies stepping forward in unison. Officer Daniel Hayes stood at the front, tall, composed, his uniform crisp under the rotating lights, his expression unreadable in the alternating colors that swept across his face. Behind him, more officers fanned out across the lawn, some already moving toward the side of the house, others speaking quietly into radios that crackled with coded urgency. It was too organized to be random, too many to be routine. "Naomi Carter?" Hayes asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Naomi met his eyes, not defiant, not submissive, just present, as if she were looking at something she had expected to see eventually. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, her voice even, almost soft, the kind of softness that made people lean in rather than dismiss. Hayes didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted briefly past her shoulder, scanning the interior, lamp, couch, hallway, the quiet signs of a life undisturbed until now, before returning to her face. "We need you to step aside, ma'am," he said instead, the words precise, practiced, and carefully avoiding the question. Behind him, a radio chirped, then went silent. Naomi didn't move. Not yet. Her fingers tightened slightly around the dish towel, a small detail, easy to miss, but real enough to anchor the moment. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then stopped, as if even the neighborhood understood this wasn't a night for noise. Naomi tilted her head just a fraction, studying Hayes, not his badge, not his uniform, but him, like she was matching a face to a memory she hadn't fully placed yet. The red light swept across her eyes, then blue, then red again, and in that rhythm, something unspoken passed through the space between them, recognition, or maybe just the hint of it. "You're not supposed to be here," she repeated, quieter this time, not as a warning, not as a protest, but as a statement of fact, and for the briefest moment, Hayes' jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a man realizing the script he'd been handed might not be the right one. Hayes held her gaze a second longer than necessary, like he was waiting for something to shift in her expression, for fear or confusion or anger to surface and justify the scene unfolding behind him. But Naomi did not offer any of it. She simply stood there with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already measured the moment and decided not to react the way it expected her to. And that absence of reaction created a small fracture in the rhythm of the operation, subtle but real, the kind that made experienced men hesitate without knowing why. "Ma'am, we are authorized to be here," Hayes said finally, his tone tightening just enough to signal impatience. Though his posture remained controlled, shoulders squared, hands visible, every movement deliberate as the red and blue lights swept across his uniform in slow pulses. Naomi glanced past him again, this time more carefully, counting without appearing to count. 1, 2, 5, 10. More still moving along the perimeter, boots soft against the grass, radios whispering in coded fragments that never quite formed full sentences, and it settled into her awareness with quiet clarity that this was not a misunderstanding, not a simple check. This was scale, intention, something prepared in advance. Authorized by who? She asked, her voice unchanged, not louder, not sharper, just precise, like each word had weight, and she was placing them carefully in the space between them. Hayes did not answer that either. Instead, he shifted half a step forward, enough to suggest movement without crossing fully into the threshold, a calculated pressure point. "Step aside so we can proceed," he said, and behind him, one of the officers adjusted his stance, glancing toward the side of the house where a narrow beam of light cut across the fence line. Another team already positioning, too coordinated to be spontaneous. Inside, the air remained still, warm from the earlier evening, carrying the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock that seemed louder now in contrast to the controlled tension at the door. Naomi's grip on the towel loosened slightly, and she let it fall onto the small table by the entryway, the fabric landing without a sound. That small motion drew Hayes' eyes for just a fraction of a second, enough for her to notice. "My son is asleep," she said, not as a plea, not as an excuse, just as a fact that existed regardless of what they intended to do next. Hayes inhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of breath meant to reset control, and nodded once, as if acknowledging the information without allowing it to alter the plan. "We will keep this brief," he replied, though the number of officers outside suggested otherwise. A radio crackled again, louder this time, and a voice on the other end spoke too quickly to catch fully, but one word cut through clearly: "Confirmed." Hayes' jaw tightened again. That same almost imperceptible shift, and Naomi saw it, the smallest flicker of uncertainty beneath the practiced exterior, like a man following instructions that did not quite align with his instincts. She took one small step back then, not surrender, not invitation, just space, enough for him to believe he had gained what he needed. Hayes moved forward into the entryway, the cool night air following him inside, and as he crossed the threshold, the light from outside stretched across the floorboards, long and sharp, dividing the room into two halves, one still and familiar, the other now occupied by something colder, more deliberate. Naomi closed the door behind him without force, just a quiet click that sealed the moment, and for a second, the noise from outside dulled, replaced by the softer, more contained tension of bodies now inside her home. Hayes turned slightly, scanning again, and Naomi watched him with that same calm focus, her eyes not drifting, not avoiding, just present, as if she were waiting for him to realize something he had not yet seen, and somewhere in the silence between them, the feeling grew stronger, not fear, not anger, but certainty, quiet and unshaken, that this was already moving in a direction they did not understand. The sound inside the house changed the moment more officers stepped in, not louder, but denser, like the air itself had thickened with intent, boots pressing softly against the floor, fabric shifting, radios breathing static in low bursts that never fully formed words, and yet carried enough authority to make the space feel smaller than it was. Hayes moved further into the living room, his eyes scanning with practiced efficiency, noting the framed photos along the wall, a small shelf with neatly arranged books, a child's drawing taped slightly crooked near the hallway entrance, the kind of detail most operations ignored but that still registered somewhere in the back of his mind. Naomi followed at a measured distance, not trailing, not leading, simply maintaining a presence that refused to disappear into the background the way someone in her position was expected to. One of the officers near the window pulled the curtain back just an inch, letting a thin line of red light slice across the floor, then released it again, the fabric falling back into place with a soft whisper. Another officer spoke quietly into his shoulder radio, confirming positions, his voice low but precise, like he was reading from a script he trusted more than his own judgment. Hayes stopped near the center of the room, turning slightly as if aligning himself with an invisible map, and for a brief second, he looked almost uncertain, not in his authority, but in the shape of the situation itself, like something did not quite match the expectation he had been given. Naomi noticed that pause, "You are looking for something," she said, her voice steady. Not a question, just an observation placed carefully into the silence. Hayes did not respond immediately. His eyes shifted toward her, then away again, scanning the hallway that led deeper into the house, where the light grew softer and warmer, where the quiet felt more protected. "We are verifying information," he said finally, choosing each word with care, though the phrasing sounded less certain than before. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the same subtle movement from earlier, as if she was listening not just to what he said, but to what he avoided saying. "Information can be wrong," she replied, and there was no accusation in it, only a calm statement that seemed to land heavier than it should have. A faint sound came from down the hall then, not loud, just the soft shift of bedsheets, the small, unconscious movement of someone sleeping, and it changed the room in an instant, grounding everything in something real and fragile that none of them had acknowledged out loud. One of the officers glanced toward the hallway, then back at Hayes, waiting for direction, his hand hovering near his radio, but not touching it. Hayes exhaled slowly again, longer this time, and for a moment, his shoulders dropped just enough to reveal the human weight beneath the uniform, the part of him that measured consequences beyond procedure. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, positioning herself just enough to block a direct line of sight into the hallway without making it obvious, a quiet adjustment that could easily be mistaken for nothing at all. "You should be careful with what you were told," she said, her voice softer now, almost reflective, like she was offering advice rather than resistance. Hayes looked at her again, more directly this time, really looking, as if trying to place her not just as a name on a file, but as something more defined, more specific, and in that moment, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, a thin crack forming in the certainty that had brought him here. Outside, a radio chirped sharply, louder than before, followed by a brief burst of static that cut through the room like a signal out of sync, and one of the officers turned toward the door instinctively, confusion flickering across his face before he masked it. When he looked back at Naomi, it was no longer with the same assumption of control, but with a question forming behind it, unspoken but present. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, and this time it was a question, not a command. Naomi did not answer immediately. She glanced once more toward the hallway, listening for the soft, steady rhythm of breathing that remained undisturbed, then returned her gaze to him. "You came here very sure," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, like she was describing something that had already happened rather than something still unfolding. Hayes held her gaze, waiting, and for a moment the rest of the room seemed to fall slightly out of focus. The officers behind him quieter now, their movements smaller, more cautious, as if they were beginning to feel the same shift without fully understanding it. "And now," Naomi added, just a slight tilt of her head accompanying the words. Hayes did not respond right away. Outside, one of the patrol car doors shut with a dull, distant thud, followed by a brief burst of radio chatter that cut off abruptly, like someone had ended it mid-sentence. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked once, then again, each second stretching longer than the last. Hayes exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling with the breath, and for the first time since he stepped inside, he looked around the room not as a place to control, but as a place he needed to understand. The framed photos, the quiet order of the space, the absence of anything that matched the scale of the operation outside, it all pressed in on him at once, not loudly, but persistently, like a detail he could no longer ignore. Naomi watched that realization settle, not rushing it, not pushing it forward, simply allowing it to exist. Then, with a small, deliberate motion, she reached toward the table beside her and picked up her phone, her fingers steady, her expression unchanged. She did not dial immediately. She simply held it there, in plain sight, not hidden, not hurried, and that alone was enough to draw every eye in the room toward it. A quiet center of gravity forming around a device that suddenly felt far more important than it should have been. Hayes' gaze dropped to the phone, then lifted back to her face, and something in his posture shifted again, not outwardly dramatic, but unmistakable, like a man realizing that whatever came next was no longer entirely under his control, and Naomi, still calm, still composed, met his eyes with that same steady certainty, as if she had already seen how this would end. No one spoke when she lifted the phone, not because they were told not to, but because something in the room had already shifted into a quieter, more cautious rhythm, the kind that makes people wait instead of act, observe instead of interrupt. Hayes' eyes followed the movement of her hand, not aggressively, not even suspiciously anymore, but with a growing awareness that whatever she was about to do mattered more than anything his team had planned. One of the officers near the window shifted his weight, the soft creak of the floor beneath his boots sounding louder than it should have. Another glanced down at his radio, as if expecting it to explain what was happening, but it remained still now, no longer offering the constant reassurance of controlled communication. Naomi held the phone at chest level, her fingers resting lightly along its edge, not gripping it tightly, not trembling, just steady, as if it were something familiar, something she had used before in moments that required precision rather than urgency. She looked at Hayes again, not challenging, not asking, simply acknowledging his presence in the moment, as if he were part of something larger that neither of them fully controlled anymore. "You still have time to step back," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying through the room without effort. And for a brief second, the words seemed to hang in the air like a choice being offered rather than a warning being given. Hayes did not respond immediately. His jaw tightened again, but not with the same certainty as before, more like someone weighing two outcomes that no longer felt equally predictable. "If there is something you need to clarify, now would be the time," he said, though the structure of the sentence felt less like authority and more like an attempt to regain it. Naomi's gaze did not shift. "I already tried that," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it, something quiet and final, that suggested this moment was not the beginning of anything, but the continuation of something that had been set in motion long before the first knock on her door. A faint sound came from the hallway again, the soft, steady breathing unchanged, and Naomi's eyes flickered there for just a fraction of a second before returning to Hayes, grounding herself in that small, constant reality. Then, without hurry, without hesitation, she unlocked the phone with a smooth, practiced motion, her thumb moving across the screen with quiet familiarity. The faint glow illuminated her face for a moment, soft light reflecting in her eyes, and in that reflection, there was no fear, no urgency, only clarity. One of the officers took a half step forward, instinct pulling him closer, but he stopped when Hayes raised a hand slightly, not fully, just enough to signal pause, and that small gesture carried more weight now than any command he had given earlier. Naomi tapped once, then again, her movements precise, minimal, and when she finally lifted the phone to her ear, the entire room seemed to lean into the silence that followed, waiting for something they could not yet define. She did not introduce herself immediately. She listened first, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and for a few seconds, there was nothing but the faint hum of the house and the distant, muffled presence of vehicles outside. Then she spoke, her voice calm, measured, carrying the same quiet certainty it had held from the beginning. "This is Naomi Carter," she said, each word clear, deliberate, and placed with intention. "I need confirmation on an active operation at my address." Hayes' eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion now, but in focus, as if he were trying to follow a thread that was just beginning to reveal itself. Naomi listened again, her gaze fixed somewhere just past him, not avoiding him, but looking beyond him, and whatever she heard on the other end did not change her expression, did not quicken her breath, did not shift her stance. It simply confirmed something she already knew. "Understood," she said quietly, and then, after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, she added one more line, softer, but somehow heavier. "Then you should notify them they are in the wrong place." The words settled into the room like a weight no one could move, and Hayes felt it, not as sound, but as realization beginning to take shape, slow and undeniable, as if the ground beneath the situation had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. The silence after her words did not break immediately. It stretched, thin and tight, like something pulled too far without snapping, and in that stretch every small sound became sharper, the faint hum of electricity in the walls, the soft brush of fabric as one officer adjusted his stance, the quiet inhale Hayes took as he processed what she had just said. He did not speak right away. His eyes remained on her, searching now, not for resistance, but for confirmation, as if he were trying to decide whether what he had heard was real or simply confidence spoken too calmly to be questioned. One of the officers behind him shifted closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, dispatch is requesting clarification on our position," he said, careful, controlled, but the edge beneath it was new, the kind that came when systems stopped aligning the way they were supposed to. Hayes did not turn. "Stand by," he replied, his voice lower now, less performative, more internal, like he was speaking as much to himself as to his team. Naomi remained still, the phone still at her ear, her gaze steady, listening to something none of them could hear, and that alone unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have. Then she spoke again, quietly, almost like a continuation of a conversation already in progress. "Yes," she said, "they are inside now." A pause followed, longer this time, and Hayes felt it, not in the air, but in the way his instincts began to shift, recalibrate, as if the framework he had been operating under was no longer stable. The officer near the hallway glanced back again, uncertain now, his earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, more cautious, and when his eyes met Hayes, there was a question there, unspoken but clear. Hayes finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge it, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, not instruction, not yet, but recognition that they were no longer moving forward in a straight line. Naomi lowered the phone just a fraction, still listening, and then nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something expected rather than surprising. "Understood," she said again, softer this time, and then she pulled the phone away from her ear, letting her hand rest. At her side, the device still lit, still active, but no longer the focus of her attention. Instead, she looked directly at Hayes, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now felt less passive and more deliberate. "You should check your channel again," she said, not as a suggestion, but as a quiet instruction, and the certainty in her tone made it difficult to ignore. Hayes hesitated for half a second, then reached for his radio, pressing the button with a firmer motion than before. "Command, this is Unit Lead, confirm authorization and status," he said, his words measured but tighter now, and this time the response came faster, clearer, cutting through the static with an urgency that had not been there before. Hayes listened, his face still, but his eyes shifting, focusing inward as the information reached him, and whatever he heard did not match what he expected. That much was clear in the subtle change along his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened, then held, as if bracing against something unseen. He did not speak for several seconds after the transmission ended. The room waited with him, every officer now quieter, more alert, as if the air itself had warned them something had changed. Hayes lowered the radio slowly, his hand lingering on it a moment longer than necessary, and when he finally looked back at Naomi, the certainty that had defined him at the door was no longer there in the same way. It had not disappeared, but it had shifted, thinned, replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Naomi did not move. She did not need to. The moment had already begun to turn, and she knew it, not with excitement, not with triumph, but with the same quiet steadiness she had held from the beginning, as if she had simply been waiting for the truth to arrive in a language they could finally understand. Hayes did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight now than any command he had given earlier, because it was no longer a pause of control but a pause of reconsideration, the kind that settles in when certainty begins to unravel piece by piece. His eyes moved once across the room again, slower this time, not scanning for threats, but searching for context, for anything that might align what he had just heard with what he believed this operation was supposed to be. It did not align. That much was clear. One of the officers near the door shifted again, glancing outside where the flashing lights still painted the street in alternating color, but even that felt different now, less like authority and more like exposure, like something too visible for what this situation was becoming. "Sir?" the officer said quietly, not pushing, just prompting, waiting for direction that had always come quickly before. Hayes lifted a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to delay, as if he needed a second longer to process the space between what he knew and what he was beginning to understand. Naomi remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but now there was something else in the room, something subtle but undeniable, a shift in who was holding the center of gravity. It was no longer the uniform, no longer the number of people inside or outside the house. It was her, standing still, saying very little, yet somehow guiding the direction of everything without raising her voice. Hayes looked at her again, more directly now, and when he spoke, his tone had changed, not dramatically, but enough that the difference could be felt. "What exactly did they tell you?" he asked, and this time it was not a test, not a trap, but a real question, one he needed answered. Naomi studied him for a brief moment, as if weighing how much he was ready to hear. "They told me you were acting on incomplete information," she said, her voice calm, each word placed carefully, "and that you were not cleared to be here." The words settled heavily, not loud, not aggressive, but firm enough that no one in the room could ignore them. Hayes' jaw tightened again, but differently now, not defensive, more restrained, like he was holding back a reaction until he understood it fully. Behind him, another radio chirped, and this time the officer did not wait. He pressed it immediately, speaking in a lower tone, trying to confirm something that was no longer clear. The response came quickly, too quickly, and when he looked back up at Hayes, there was no attempt to hide the confusion in his expression. Hayes did not turn to him right away. He kept his focus on Naomi, as if she was now the most reliable source of clarity in the room. "And you?" he asked, quieter now. "Who are you cleared with?" Naomi did not answer immediately. She took a small step toward the hallway, just enough to reposition herself, not retreating, not advancing, simply adjusting her place in the space, and that small movement drew Hayes' attention again, reminding him of what was just beyond that hallway, the reason she had mentioned it more than once without raising her voice. Then she looked back at him, her expression still composed, still steady. "The same people who just told you to reconsider your position," she said, and there was no pride in it, no edge, just a simple statement of alignment, as if she were referencing something larger than both of them. Hayes inhaled slowly, the breath deeper this time, and when he exhaled, something in his posture shifted again, the rigid certainty easing just enough to make room for something else, something closer to awareness. Around them, the officers had grown quieter, their movements smaller, more deliberate, no longer advancing, no longer pressing forward, but holding, waiting, watching, as if they too could feel the operation slipping out of the structure they had relied on. Outside, another vehicle door closed, but no one moved to respond. Inside, the clock ticked again, steady and indifferent, marking a moment that had already begun to turn. Hayes lowered his gaze for just a second, then lifted it back to Naomi, and in that brief motion, the shift became clear, not a collapse, not yet, but the beginning of one, the moment where authority stops pushing forward and starts asking what it has stepped into, and Naomi, still calm, still grounded, met that moment without resistance, as if she had known all along that it would come. The room did not move, but something within it continued to shift, subtle and steady, like a tide pulling away from shore before anyone fully realized the water was receding. Hayes stood still, but his stillness had changed, no longer rooted in control, now anchored in calculation, his mind catching up to a situation that had quietly outrun his assumptions. He lifted his radio again, slower this time, his fingers pressing the button with intention rather than reflex. "Command, clarify chain of authorization for this operation," he said, his voice controlled but stripped of the earlier certainty, and this time there was no delay in the response, no static, no distortion, just a clear voice that spoke with a level of authority that did not need to raise its volume to be understood. Hayes listened, and as he did, the change in him became visible, not dramatic, not sudden, but unmistakable, the tightening along his jaw easing into something heavier, the kind of realization that settles rather than strikes. One of the officers near the door watched him closely, reading the shift without needing to hear the words, his posture straightening slightly, as if bracing for new instructions. Hayes did not interrupt the transmission. He stood there, absorbing it, and when it ended, he did not immediately lower the radio. He held it there for a second longer, like he was confirming to himself that what he had just heard was real. Then slowly, he let his hand fall. The silence that followed was different from before, not tense in the same way, but weighted, like something had been placed into the room that could not be ignored. Hayes looked at Naomi again, and this time there was no attempt to assert control in his gaze, only recognition, quiet and reluctant, but present. They just updated the directive, he said, his voice lower now, more measured, and every officer in the room heard the difference. Naomi did not react outwardly. She did not need to. She had already felt the shift before he spoke it. Then you understand. She replied softly, not as a question, but as a continuation of the same steady line she had held from the beginning. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath longer, heavier, and for a moment he looked past her, toward the hallway again, the quiet space that had remained untouched through all of this, and something in that glance grounded him in a way the operation never had. We were given partial clearance, he said, almost to himself, the words coming slower now, like he was piecing them together as he spoke, but not the full context. Naomi tilted her head slightly, that same small gesture, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, only calm acknowledgement. That happens, she said, her voice even, when people act too fast. One of the officers shifted again, his radio crackling softly as if echoing the statement, and he looked toward Hayes, waiting, not just for orders, but for direction that now carried different weight. Hayes nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, and then he turned slightly, addressing his team without raising his voice. Hold position, he said, and the words landed differently than before, not as a command pushing forward, but as one pulling everything back into place. Outside, the flashing lights continued, but even they seemed less dominant now, less defining, as if the scene they had created was no longer aligned with the reality inside the house. Naomi remained where she was, her phone still in her hand, the screen dimming slowly as the call ended, and when she looked at Hayes again, it was with the same steady presence, unchanged from the first moment, as if everything that had shifted around them had simply moved into alignment with what she already knew. Hayes met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no resistance in it, only the quiet acknowledgement of a situation that had revealed itself piece by piece, until it could no longer be ignored, and in that moment, the balance in the room settled into something new, something that no longer needed to be forced, because it had already become clear. The shift did not arrive with noise or urgency. It settled quietly, like a decision made somewhere far above them that simply reached the room without asking permission, and everyone felt it before anyone spoke it again. Hayes stood in place, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either, caught in that narrow space between command and reconsideration, and for a moment he did something he had not done since stepping through the door. He listened, not to the radios, not to his officers, but to the room itself, to the absence of threat, to the quiet consistency of everything that did not match the scale of what they had brought with them. One of the officers near the entrance cleared his throat softly, not out of impatience, but out of uncertainty, and when Hayes turned slightly toward him, the question was already there, waiting. "Sir, do we proceed or stand down?" he asked, his voice low, careful, as if choosing the wrong tone might shift the situation further in a direction none of them fully understood. Hayes did not answer immediately. His eyes moved once more toward Naomi, and this time, there was no attempt to measure her, no effort to define her role in the situation, only the quiet recognition that she had been the constant in a moment that had otherwise changed completely. Naomi met his gaze, steady as before, her presence unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, her phone now dark, resting lightly in her palm like something that had already served its purpose. "You already know the answer," she said, her voice soft, not pushing, not challenging, just stating what had become obvious in a way that required no explanation. Hayes held her gaze for a second longer, then exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a weight that was not frustration, not even regret, but something closer to acceptance. He turned slightly, addressing his team without raising his voice. "We are done here," he said, and the words landed differently than any command he had given that night, not sharp, not forceful, but final in a way that did not need emphasis. The officers did not react immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the shift had already begun inside them before the words confirmed it, and now they simply moved to match it, one by one, stepping back, adjusting positions, lowering radios, the quiet choreography of withdrawal replacing the earlier precision of entry. Outside, the flashing lights still moved across the street, but their presence felt out of place now, like a scene that had not yet caught up to its own ending. One officer reached for the door, opening it slowly, letting the cool night air drift back inside. And with it came the faint sound of distant traffic, the normal rhythm of a world that had continued uninterrupted while this moment unfolded. Hayes remained where he was for a second longer, looking around the room one last time, not scanning, not assessing, just taking in the quiet details he had overlooked before, the framed photographs, the soft glow of the lamp, the stillness that had never been broken. Then he looked back at Naomi. "This should not have happened," he said, his voice lower now, not defensive, not formal, just honest in a way that did not require explanation. Naomi nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, not in agreement, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. "But it did," she replied, and there was no weight in the words, no accusation, just truth, simple and unadorned. Hayes held that for a moment, then gave a slight nod of his own, the gesture restrained but real, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his team already moving ahead of him, their presence receding from the space they had filled only minutes before. The door remained open for a second longer, the light from outside stretching across the floor one last time. Then it closed with a soft, quiet click, and just like that, the house returned to its original silence, as if nothing had happened, except for the subtle shift that lingered in the air, the kind that does not fade quickly, because it does not belong to noise, it belongs to understanding. The house did not return to silence all at once, it settled into it gradually, like the echo of something large fading through the walls, leaving behind only what had always been there. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock, the soft, distant rhythm of a child breathing undisturbed down the hallway. Naomi stood where she was for a moment longer, not moving immediately after the door closed, as if allowing the space to fully reclaim itself before she stepped back into it. The absence of flashing lights through the curtains shifted the color of the room, the warm amber from the lamp filling in where red and blue had once cut sharply across the floor, softening everything back into place. She exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding without realizing it, not from fear, but from focus, the kind that keeps everything steady until the moment no longer requires it. Her hand lowered slightly, the phone still resting in her palm, its screen now dark, reflective, showing only a faint outline of her face for a brief second before she turned it over and set it gently on the table beside her. The fabric of the dish towel lay exactly where she had left it earlier, untouched, a small detail that felt strangely grounding, as if time inside the house had paused while everything else had moved forward. She picked it up again, absent-mindedly folding it once, then setting it neatly beside the sink, her movements slow, deliberate, returning to something ordinary without rushing to erase what had just happened. From outside, the sound of engines starting reached her, low and distant, followed by the gradual movement of vehicles pulling away, one after another, until even that faded into the background, leaving the street as it had been before, quiet, unremarkable, as if nothing had ever interrupted it. Naomi walked a few steps toward the hallway, her bare feet soft against the floor, each step measured, not cautious, but intentional, as if she were moving through a space that still held the memory of what had passed through it. She paused at the entrance, listening, not for danger, but for confirmation, and the sound was there, steady and unchanged, the quiet rhythm of sleep that had not been broken. She leaned slightly against the frame for a second, her eyes softening just a fraction, the only visible sign that something within her had shifted now that the moment had passed. Then she stepped back, not entering, not needing to, just ensuring everything remained as it should be. In the living room, the light continued to glow softly, illuminating the same small details Hayes had noticed too late, the photographs, the books, the quiet order of a life that did not match the scale of what had been brought against it. Naomi returned to the center of the room, her gaze moving once across the space, not inspecting, not questioning, simply acknowledging that it was still hers, unchanged in the ways that mattered. The air felt lighter now, not because something had been removed, but because something had been corrected, realigned in a way that did not require explanation. She stood there for a moment longer, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, and then she reached for the lamp, her fingers brushing the switch with a gentle motion, dimming the light slightly, not turning it off, just softening it, as if the night itself deserved to return to its natural pace. Outside, the street had fully settled, the last trace of the earlier presence gone, replaced by the distant, familiar sounds of a city continuing on without interruption. Inside, Naomi remained still, not thinking ahead, not looking back, simply standing in the quiet that followed, a quiet that did not feel empty, but complete, like something that had reached its end without needing to announce it. The night settled deeper, not heavier, just quieter, like the world outside had taken a step back and decided to leave this house alone. And Naomi felt it in the stillness that remained, the kind that did not demand attention but held it gently, like a steady hand on a shoulder. She moved slowly toward the kitchen, her steps soft, deliberate, each motion returning her further into the rhythm of her own space, the ordinary details that had never left, only waited. The faucet handle turned with a small click, water running briefly, the sound clear and simple, rinsing away the faint trace of soap still clinging to the sink, and she stood there for a moment, watching the stream as if it anchored her back into something real and unshaken. Behind her, the living room remained untouched, the lamp casting that same warm light across the floor, no longer interrupted, no longer divided. She reached for a glass, filled it halfway, then paused, listening again, not out of concern, but out of habit, the kind that stays long after it is no longer needed. The house answered the same way it had before, steady, unchanged, and she took a small sip, setting the glass down with care, not making a sound. Somewhere beyond the walls, a car passed slowly, tires rolling over pavement in a soft, distant rhythm, the kind of sound that belongs to a normal night. And for a brief second, Naomi let that normalcy settle in, not as relief, but as confirmation. She turned off the faucet completely, wiping her hands on the towel she had folded earlier, the fabric cool and familiar, and then she leaned lightly against the counter, her eyes drifting once more toward the hallway. The door at the end remained closed, the light beneath it faint, steady, and she did not move toward it this time. She did not need to, because everything that mattered behind it had remained untouched by everything that had just passed through the front door. Her phone sat where she had left it, quiet, still, and after a moment, she picked it up again, not urgently, not even with intention, just to hold it, to feel its weight, the same way one might hold on to something that had just changed the course of a moment without ever raising its voice. She did not check the screen. She did not scroll. She simply placed it back down, face down this time, letting it disappear into the surface of the table as if it no longer needed to be part of what came next. The clock on the wall ticked again, steady, indifferent, marking time in a way that felt almost distant now, like it belonged to a different pace than the one she had just moved through. Naomi pushed herself gently off the counter and walked back into the living room, her gaze moving across the space once more, slower this time, not searching, just seeing, acknowledging each detail as it returned fully to its place. She adjusted the edge of the blanket on the couch, smoothing it with a light touch, a small, quiet correction, and then she paused, her hand resting there for a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something simple and tangible. Outside, the street remained calm, no flashing lights, no distant voices, just the low hum of a city at rest. And inside, Naomi stood in the center of it all, not changed in the way people might expect, not shaken, not triumphant, just present, exactly as she had been from the beginning, steady in a way that did not need to be explained. She turned slightly toward the hallway once more, her expression softening just enough to show what she had protected, what had mattered more than anything else in that moment. And then she reached for the lamp again, dimming it just a little further, letting the room fall into a softer glow, the kind that belongs to a night that has returned to itself, quiet, complete, and undisturbed. The house breathed in its own quiet, a steady, gentle rhythm that no longer carried tension, only presence, and Naomi stood within it without needing to fill the silence, letting it settle naturally around her like something earned rather than restored. The light in the living room had softened to a low amber glow, stretching shadows across the walls in calm, familiar shapes, no longer fractured by movement or urgency, and every object seemed to sit exactly where it belonged, unchanged in form but different in meaning, as if the room itself had witnessed something and chosen not to speak about it. Naomi moved slowly toward the window, not with curiosity, but with quiet completion, her fingertips brushing lightly against the curtain before pulling it back just an inch, enough to see the street without exposing the inside, a small, controlled gesture that mirrored everything she had done that night. Outside, the pavement lay still under the streetlights, no trace left of what had filled it before, no flashing colors, no clustered shadows, only the distant glow of a city continuing its own story without interruption. And for a moment, she simply watched it, not searching, not reflecting, just observing the absence of what had been there. Her hand released the curtain, letting it fall back into place with a soft, familiar whisper, and she turned away without hesitation, the outside world already dismissed as something no longer relevant to what remained inside. The clock ticked again, marking time in quiet intervals, and Naomi glanced at it briefly, not to measure the night, but to acknowledge its passing, the way one might notice the steady movement of something constant after everything else has shifted. She walked toward the hallway again, her steps unhurried, her presence light, and when she reached the doorway, she paused just long enough to listen once more, the soft, even breathing still there, unchanged, grounding everything that had come before in something simple and undeniable. She leaned gently against the frame, her shoulder resting there for a second, her eyes closing briefly, not from exhaustion, but from a kind of quiet release, the moment after tension dissolves when nothing needs to be held together anymore. Then she straightened, stepping back into the living room, her movements fluid, unforced, and she crossed the space with the same calm precision that had defined her from the beginning, not as someone reclaiming control, but as someone who had never lost it. The phone remained where she had placed it, still, silent, and she passed it without picking it up, leaving it behind as if it had already served its role completely, no longer necessary for what came next. The air carried a faint trace of lemon cleaner and warm wood, familiar, grounding, and Naomi inhaled it slowly, the scent anchoring her back into the ordinary in a way that felt more meaningful now than it ever had before. She reached for the lamp once more, her fingers adjusting it slightly, not dimming it further this time, just aligning it, a small correction that brought the light into a softer balance across the room, eliminating a shadow that had fallen unevenly across the floor. Then she stepped back, looking at the space. Not critically, not analytically, but simply seeing it whole again, complete in a way that did not require perfection, only presence. Outside, the faint sound of wind moved through distant trees, barely audible, and inside, the house held its quiet with quiet dignity, unchanged in its purpose, untouched in what mattered. Naomi stood there for a moment longer, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and then she turned slightly, her gaze drifting once more toward the hallway, not out of concern, but out of care, the kind that does not demand attention but remains constant, steady, and unwavering. The night continued around her, soft and uninterrupted, and in that stillness, everything that had unfolded settled into something simple, something clear, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The night did not end with a moment of closure. It continued the way it always had, quiet, steady, indifferent to what had passed through it. And that was what made it feel complete, not because something had been resolved loudly, but because nothing more needed to happen. Naomi stood near the center of the room, the soft light resting against her shoulders, outlining her in a way that felt calm rather than dramatic. And for a moment, she simply breathed, slow and even, the kind of breath that belongs to someone who does not need to rush into what comes next. The house remained exactly as it had been, unchanged in structure, unchanged in purpose, and yet it carried something new, not visible, not tangible, but present, like a quiet understanding woven into the space itself. She walked once more toward the hallway, her steps light, her presence gentle, and when she reached the door, she rested her hand against the frame, not opening it, not needing to, just feeling the quiet beyond it, the steady rhythm that had remained untouched, and in that small, silent exchange, everything that mattered was confirmed without a single word. Her hand lingered there for a second, then slowly fell back to her side, and she turned away again, returning to the living room without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing left behind that needed her attention. The phone remained on the table, still and dark, and this time she did not even glance at it as she passed, leaving it where it was, a tool that had already completed its role, no longer carrying any weight in the present moment. The clock ticked again, steady, marking time in the same quiet way it always had, and Naomi looked at it briefly, not measuring anything, just acknowledging its presence, the way one notices something constant without needing to question it. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the street, barely audible, stirring leaves somewhere beyond the window, and the sound drifted in just enough to remind her that the world had continued, unchanged, unaffected, as if what had happened here existed only within these walls. She moved toward the lamp once more, her fingers brushing lightly against it, not adjusting it this time, just touching it, a small, grounding gesture that anchored her in the present. Then she stepped back, her gaze moving slowly across the room, not searching, not analyzing, simply seeing it as it was, whole, complete, untouched in the ways that mattered most. There was no need for reflection, no need for explanation, because the moment had already settled into something simple, something clear, something that did not require words to hold its meaning. Naomi stood there for a final second, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, and then she turned slightly toward the hallway once more, not out of concern, not out of habit, but out of something quieter, something deeper, the kind of care that does not need to be spoken to exist. The night held steady around her, soft and uninterrupted, and in that stillness, everything that had unfolded became just another part of it, not erased, not forgotten, but absorbed into the quiet fabric of the moment. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She simply stood there, present, steady, and complete, and the house, now fully returned to itself, held that quiet with her, unchanged and unbroken, as if it had always known it would end this way.